So when we're talking about intercultural literacy, we really also need to know what we mean by culture. That was one of the key components, of intercultural literacy, is that cultural piece. But what do we mean by that? So culture means different things to different people in different contexts. When you first hear the word culture, some of you may be thinking of what is sometimes called high culture, which is the art and music and other forms of literature and that kind of thing that we think of as our cultural heritage. But if you were a farmer, you might think of a farm that is under cultivation. That was the original meaning of the term. Or if you're a biologist, when you hear the word culture, you might be thinking of something like this. What we're going to be talking about when we talk about intercultural literacy is more of a social science type definition of culture. So the social sciences, that includes sociology, anthropology, political science, economics, sometimes history, sometimes education. All of these fields talk about and sometimes study culture and have slightly different definitions. So here's a philosopher's definition of culture. Here's a definition from the Dictionary of Race, Ethnicity, and Culture. Definition from the American Sociological Association. So this is a definition that sociologists use. Here's a comparison of a whole bunch of different definitions of culture. And this is a lot of words. When we pull these all out, we can see that there is a lot of overlap between the different definitions of culture, concepts that come up again and again. So pulling from all of these different sources and narrowing things down, streamlining a whole lot in order to get sort of a working definition of culture that we can use when we're talking about intercultural literacy. Here's a very stripped down working definition. So culture, what we're going to be talking about, refers to the knowledge, behavior, and attitudes common to a particular group of people. This is very simplified. This is not a definition that you will find in any particular class, but this is a definition that will work for our purposes. So let's break that down. A particular group of people, what do we mean by this? Well, this is a group of people who can be distinguished from other groups of people, even though the boundaries might be fuzzy. So the people in the group and often the people outside of the group recognize that this is in some way a distinct group of people, that there is an in-group and an out-group. We're talking about groups that persist over time and across generations, although they do also change and evolve. So we're not talking about like the people who happen to be in Times Square today. That's not the kind of group that has a cultural identity. We're talking about groups that have an identity that persists over time. It does change and evolve, definitely. All of the pieces that go into this change and evolve over time. But we're talking about something that is not just here for a day. So let's see. And there are different levels. So we'll talk about groups and subgroups. There's sort of a macro level, which are these very large identities that you can distinguish some things that people have in common. But really there's just tremendous variety within the group, the macro group, many divisions of the group. So we're talking here about Western society, or American culture, Midwesterners. You'll hear the phrase Iowa nice. That's getting a little bit narrower. Then there are smaller groups, smaller populations, which still can contain subgroups, but they have more universal experiences across the people in the group, and maybe have more in common with each other. So here we're talking about like the Cornell community. Everybody at Cornell has some shared experiences, if only the fact that we call ourselves Cornellians or Rams. Ethnic enclaves in big cities, Mount Vernonites, cosplayers, particularly, the ones who actually communicate with each other, that kind of thing. And then there are subgroups, which may be united by just a particular interest and have few, if any, subdivisions within that group. So the Chess and Games Club here at Cornell is, as we're going from there's Western society, there's humanity is the biggest level, and then there's Western society, there's American, there's Midwestern, there's Iowan, there's Cornellian, and then we get down to chess and games is maybe one of the smallest divisions that doesn't get subdivided a whole lot. Members of a particular church or temple, so the Mount Vernon Methodist Church or Catholic Church or whatever, rather than Methodists as a whole, for example. Co-workers in a single office, that kind of thing. So the next piece was knowledge. So examples of cultural knowledge. This is really important. Language. And here we don't just mean like learning a foreign language, but it can also be learning how people within the same language use words differently. So you might hear the phrase, the US and England are two countries divided by a common language, because so many of our words are different between the two. We'll use different terms for the same concept or the same word that means different things. Unstated rules of behavior, when, how long, and for whom you should hold a door open. This is the kind of thing where it varies a lot depending on where you live. Now that you're in Mount Vernon, you'll see that people hold the door open a lot for everybody and will hold it for a long time. When I lived in LA, that just didn't happen. When it's okay to talk to strangers, etc. Common knowledge, what we might call common knowledge. This is the kind of thing where you can say, it goes without saying, and it really does. Like everybody that you're talking to knows what you're talking about. These are factual pieces. And these are things that the distinguishing feature of this is that you can expect that the people in the culture will share this factual knowledge, and you don't necessarily expect that people outside of the culture share it. Although they could learn those facts, but they don't necessarily, it's not an expected part of their knowledge base. And finally, knowledge of culturally specific practices and norms, such as how, so these sound like facts, but these are facts that can change depending on cultural context. So how long is a year and how is it divided? This can change, right? So we in the US have a 365-day year unless it's a leap year. We divide it into weeks and months, and we know what that means. But other places, other times, people have divided up the year differently. Maybe they use a lunar year, which is a different length. Maybe the divisions of the year are different. And a lot of these are pieces that we might, if we haven't thought about it before, we might think that these are universal. Like how many genders are there and how do we determine who is what gender? But they're actually culturally determined and can change from culture to culture. So, and finally, behaviors. And some examples of behaviors would be making and using art and other physical artifacts, and modes of interaction. So this is, some of this is related to the pieces that we were just talking about in terms of unstated expectations, but this is when we act out those expectations. And attitudes. This is states of mind. So religion, values, ethics, morality. How do we decide what's good, what's bad? How do we define who are people even? So, we in the West have pretty strict definitions of who's people and who's not. But that's not always, those aren't the only ways of thinking about personhood and inness and outness. Even within your own acquaintances, some people may consider their pets to be people. Some people may consider other people to not be people, depending on their particular prejudices and attitudes. Ways of knowing. This is what this entire course is focused on. How do we determine what's true and what's real? And this varies a lot. So there's the scientific method, which is a classical Western way of testing and determining reality. But there are a lot of other ways that cultures use to decide what's real and what's true. Finally, our interpretation of the meaning and reasons behind our behaviors. Clifford it was Clifford Geertz, an anthropologist, famously said that culture are the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves. So what we tell ourselves and what we interpret as the reasons behind the things that we do. So if we are holding the door open for other people, why are we doing that? Or if we aren't, why don't we? All right, so points for future discussion, things to talk about and think about related to culture. And there are many classes that this will come up in. So these are points for you to contemplate. So first of all, what cultures and subcultures do you belong to? Most of us, there are going to be many of these that overlap and intersect in different ways. How does that cultural background intersect with other aspects of your identity? And how does culture influence both how we behave and also, really crucially, how we interpret the behavior of others? This is one of the key pieces for intercultural literacy, because if we are viewing people from other cultural contexts through the lens of our own culture, we may be misinterpreting what they're doing, what their intentions are, what their reactions are. So think about those and talk about those.